The hall did not go quiet for her. It went quiet because of what Elder Cress said next, and what he said next was her name, spoken in the particular way a man speaks a name when he wants the room to understand that the person it belongs to does not quite deserve one. Lachlan Ashford stood at the base of the tribute dais with her hands loose at her sides and her commission cloth folded across one arm, still warm from the press, and she heard her name roll out across the assembled gathering like a stone dropped into shallow water, not deep enough to drown, just enough to ripple. Elder Cress read it from his parchment the same way he read the others, flat, clipped, without the small courtesy of a pause. But the pause came anyway, from the crowd. She felt it against her skin before she understood what it meant. She had not come to the gathering as a petitioner. She had come with 3 bolts of border weave commissioned by the hall's own steward, the kind of work that took 11 days to finish and paid enough to cover her apprentice fee through the cold months. She had come as a working woman with a delivery to make, and she had been standing at the edge of the lower floor waiting for the steward's clerk when Cress had called her name from the selection list, and the room had paused, and the pause had told her everything she needed to know about what kind of story this hall intended to make her part of. She did not yet know that someone in the crowd was watching her face as that pause landed. She did not yet know that he had been watching her face for 3 days. The tribute gathering came to the border town of Veld once each year, at the first week of the dry season when the mountain roads opened and the council's appointed elders rode down from the Valdric seat to collect whatever the hierarchy deemed owed: livestock assessments, rank confirmations, guild standing reviews, and the tribute selection, which was the part of the gathering that nobody in Veld discussed aloud in the weeks before, and everyone discussed in low voices the weeks after. A name called from the list meant your standing was under review. It meant the council believed something of yours was available to be claimed. Lachlan had been apprentice to her guild mistress, an older woman named Fen, for nearly 4 years. She had earned the right to carry commissions under her own name for 11 months of that 4 years, which was not long enough to have accumulated enough standing to appear on any selection list. She had no lineage the council recognized. Her mother had died when Lachlan was 14 and had left her a pair of good shears, the lease on a small workroom above a chandler's shop, and a name that nobody in Veld's ranked houses had ever needed to remember. She had arrived at the gathering that morning with her bolts of border weave pressed into a clean stack, Sable padding close at her heel. Sable was not precisely hers. She had appeared at the workroom door 18 months ago during a late frost, thin and solitary, and had simply refused to leave. Lachlan had left a scrap of rabbit on the threshold, and Sable had taken it and settled beneath the cutting table, and neither of them had discussed the arrangement since. She was not large enough yet to be impressive, but she was steady, and she walked at Lachlan's side through the market stalls with the calm attentiveness of an animal who had already decided what she was protecting. It was Sable who had first drawn the man's attention. The merchant's cart boy had been trying to shift a badly loaded grain sack when his elbow caught the edge of Lachlan's delivery stack, and the 3 bolts of cloth had gone down onto the cobblestones in a slow, terrible arc that she had no free hands to stop. She had made a sound she was not proud of. The cart boy had gone white and started apologizing in a way that suggested he was more afraid of his employer than of any harm he'd caused her. A pair of hands had gathered the first bolt before it could pick up grit from the stones. She had looked up expecting the cart boy's employer, or perhaps a guild runner, or anyone whose assistance came with a clear account of what she owed in return. What she found was a man in plain wool, unremarkable in every particular, with quiet hands and no insignia on his collar, and the kind of stillness that did not seem to belong to someone standing in the middle of a busy market. "The pile edge is still clean," he said, checking the fold without being asked to. "The middle bolt took the worst of it. You'll want to repress that one before delivery." She had not said thank you immediately, which she recognized as rude. She had said, "I know how cloth folds." He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read, and then he had set the bolt on top of the stack in a way that suggested he agreed with her, and walked on. She had watched him go with the particular irritation of someone who has been helped by a stranger and cannot find a reasonable objection to the help. If you are finding this story compelling, stay with it. The man in plain wool is not finished asking questions, and neither is the hall. If you are watching this for the first time, consider subscribing so the next story finds you. She saw him again the next morning, in the section of the market where the commission weavers displayed samples. She was there to collect the acknowledgement slip for her delivery, and he was there for no reason she could identify. He stood near the edge of the sample display with the focused attention of someone who knew what he was looking at, which was unusual, because most of the people who passed through the weaving section that time of year were assessing goods for purchase, not studying the technique of the construction. He asked the sample weaver beside Lachlan a question about border pattern ratios that she would not have expected from a man in plain wool. The sample weaver answered vaguely and moved on. Lachlan, who had strong opinions about border pattern ratios, corrected the answer before she could stop herself. He turned and regarded her with the same expression as the day before, the one she could not quite decode. "You finished the commission the steward's clerk collected yesterday," he said. It was not a question. "3 bolts," she said. 12 count with selvage borders. "The border weave on the northern bolt was double-locked," he said. "I noticed it when the clerk logged them in." She held still for a moment. Nobody noticed a double-lock selvage unless they were specifically looking for it, or unless they understood exactly why a craftsperson would add that time to a piece. It was a mark of quality the guild recognized and the general public ignored, and she had been doing it since her 2nd year of apprenticeship on the understanding that it mattered, even when nobody saw it. "It matters on a high-traffic piece," she said carefully, still unsure of the shape of this conversation. "Yes," he said. "It does." She did not know what to do with a stranger who noticed double-lock selvage. She filed it in the part of her mind that collected things she had not yet made sense of, and she took her acknowledgement slip and left. She saw him again on the 3rd morning, near the edge of the lower market where the commission notices were posted. He was reading the gathering's formal schedule, the long list of council proceedings that most working people in Veld glanced at once and avoided thereafter. He was reading it the way someone reads a document they have a stake in. She noticed, because she was also reading the schedule, and she was doing so because Fen had told her the day before to check whether the guild's standing review would fall before or after the tribute selection. He looked up when she stopped beside him. "Guild standing reviews are listed first," she said, because the silence had begun to feel like a question. "Day 4 of the formal session." "And the tribute selection," he said, his voice careful in a way she noticed but did not yet know how to name. "Day 4 as well," she said. "After the reviews." He was quiet for a moment, watching the posted schedule, and then he said, "Is your name on the review list?" She looked at him. It should not be. What she meant was that she had done nothing to put herself in the council's path. What she heard in her own voice was something that sounded uncomfortably close to hoping. "No," he said, and his expression had changed into something she read as closed off, as though a door had been quietly shut. "It should not be." She walked back to the workroom with Sable close at her side, and the feeling that the man in plain wool knew something she did not, and that whatever he knew, he had decided she should learn it from someone else. She did not see him again until the hall. The formal session of the tribute gathering convened on the morning of the 4th day in the council hall that occupied the northern edge of Veld's Market Square. It was the oldest building in the town, built in the period when the Valdric seat had governed the border territories with a heavier hand, and it had the particular cold quality of a room that had been used for a long time to make decisions about other people. The stone floor held the chill regardless of how many bodies filled it. The oil lamps along the gallery walls cast a flat, even light that flattered nobody. Lachlan had come because Fen had asked her to attend the guild standing review as a witness for another apprentice, a girl named Sora whose renewal was procedurally straightforward and needed a second signature. She had not come expecting to be named. She had brought her acknowledgement slip in her work bag on the off chance the steward's clerk needed to verify the commission. She had not brought any other documents because there had been no reason to. She was standing at the edge of the lower floor, watching the review proceedings from a position near the gallery steps, when Elder Cress lifted his second parchment and read her name from the tribute selection list with the flat, clipped voice of a man reading livestock inventory. The pause from the crowd landed against her chest like a closed fist. Cress set the parchment down and looked at her across the floor with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a particular moment and is now inhabiting it with comfort. He was a lean elder with a close-cut beard and the particular confidence of someone who had spent 20 years making procedural decisions that other people lived inside. His council robes were the expensive kind, wool that held its shape. He wore them with the easy authority of someone who had never needed to earn authority from the outside. Lachlan Ashford, he said, making the name sound like a category rather than a person. Border girl, unmarked and unranked. The selection list stands as read. She heard the phrase land. She heard it find its place in the room. Find the other faces turning toward her. Find the particular arrangement of eyes and mouths that told her the hierarchy had already decided what she was, and was now simply naming it for the record. She was aware of the man in plain wool. She could not have said where he stood, precisely, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of a still point in a moving room, an absence of drift. And she knew he was watching her face. She did not perform composure. She simply had it. The way she had learned to have it in the years after her mother died, and the guild's ranked members explained in small procedural ways that her mother's name carried no weight. It was not peace. It was a long practice of standing still while something passed over her. I did not petition for selection, she said. Her voice came out level and carried well in the cold hall. Cress lifted one hand from his parchment. The selection is not petitioned. It is assigned. By what authority, she said, is a working guild member assigned to a tribute list without a standing review that names a deficiency? There was a small, weighted silence in the hall. Cress smiled, a smile that occupied only the lower part of his face. By the authority of this council's charter, your standing is subject to review, as all unmarked guild members are during the gathering. The selection follows. Sora Vane's review was heard this morning, Lachlan said, keeping her voice flat and specific. It required documentation of standing and a procedural notice filed 14 days prior. I received no notice. Someone in the crowd made a small sound, not of support, of interest. The procedure for unmarked members, Cress said, does not require advance notice, as you would know if you had standing to access the charter. He looked briefly toward the gallery, and Lachlan followed his gaze and saw Mira Felsen standing at the gallery rail. Mira was the daughter of a ranked house with a long council history, and the kind of face that had never been asked to do anything difficult. She had been circling the commission market for 2 seasons, acquiring clients from working women who lacked the standing to keep them. Lachlan had lost 1 commission to Mira's house last autumn, and she had understood at the time that it had been taken rather than earned, and she had understood as well that the mechanism for taking it was exactly the sort of procedural leverage that Cress had spent 20 years perfecting. She understood in this moment what the selection was for. The tribute selection requires my acceptance, Lachlan said. She had read the charter. She had read it 7 months ago, for no reason she could name at the time, sitting in the guild archive on a slow afternoon, with Sable asleep on the stone floor beside her. She had read it the way a person who expects to have nothing reads the rules of the world they live in, not with urgency, but with the steady attention of someone who intends to understand the shape of what can be used against them. I do not accept. Cress set his hands flat on the dais. Your refusal is noted. You understand that refusing a tribute selection during an active standing review constitutes grounds for guild standing suspension pending council review. I understand, she said. I refuse anyway. The hall was very quiet. Somewhere near the back wall, in the part of the room where the stillness gathered thickest, a single figure did not move. She felt his attention like a change in air pressure, and she did not look at him, because she had already decided that the room would not see her look to anyone for support, and because she was, in some part of herself she had not examined, afraid of what she might find if she looked. Pity, perhaps. Or the closed expression of a man who had decided someone else's refusal was not his business. She had been refused her own business often enough to know how the face looked. She took her work bag and walked to the lower exit of the hall with the particular care of a person who will not hurry, regardless of what they are leaving behind. The afternoon light outside was pale and thin, the dry season not yet warmed into itself, and Sable was waiting at the base of the hall's outer steps. The wolf had not been permitted inside. She rose when Lachlan appeared and pressed her narrow head against Lachlan's hand, and Lachlan held that contact for a moment with her eyes closed, because it was the only warmth in the immediate vicinity of herself. She walked back to the workroom. She did not cry. There was too much to think through for crying, and she had learned a long time ago that thinking and crying occupied the same interior space, and could not happen simultaneously. She lit the cutting table lamp and sat down with the charter text she had copied from the archive, and worked through the standing suspension clause with the focused attention of someone looking for the line where the procedure gave way. She found two procedural deficiencies in Cress's process. The advance notice requirement applied to all members, marked or unmarked, by the charter's original text. A later amendment had attempted to carve out the unmarked exception, but the amendment had not been properly witnessed by the required second elder signature. It was a small gap, the kind that only mattered if someone was paying close attention. She was always paying close attention. She set the parchment down and looked at Sable on the floor and said, "It will need someone with standing to present it." Sable opened one pale eye and looked at her. "I know," Lachlan said. She was still at the table when Sable lifted her head. The wolf's attention had shifted to the door before any sound reached the room, which was how Lachlan knew someone was outside. She rose, crossed the room, and opened the door onto the narrow stair landing with her charter copy in her hand, already composing the sentence that would explain to Fen why she needed a second signature by morning. The man in plain wool was standing on the landing. He was not alone. A second man stood slightly behind him, broad-shouldered, with the particular way of standing that said he had spent considerable time accounting for the space around someone else. He had the expression of a person who was watching his companion with more attention than the situation seemed to require. "You referenced the charter," the man in plain wool said, without preamble, without apology for standing at her door at dusk. "The advance notice clause." She regarded him for a moment with the charter copy in her hand. "You were in the hall," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "You heard the exchange?" "Yes." She looked at the second man. He had the very slight expression of someone watching something confirm what he had already suspected. "Who are you?" she said, and she directed the question at the man in wool, because she had been carrying the question for 3 days, and the weight of it had become specific. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering the answer in a way that told her it was not simple. "My name is Rowan," he said. "I am in Veld as part of a border assessment." She absorbed this without moving. Border assessments were conducted by Valdric seat officials as a matter of standing practice. She knew this from the guild archive as well, and they were sometimes conducted incognito, a custom she had read about in the historical records as though it were the sort of thing that happened in other times, rather than in the present week in the border town where she lived. "The advance notice clause," she said again, holding the charter copy out to him. He took it. He read it in the way a person reads a document they are cross-referencing against something already held in their memory, quickly, precisely, without the performance of reading. His eyes stopped at the same line hers had. "The amendment is improperly witnessed," he said. "Yes," she said. "It requires a second elder signature. The parchment in the council archive has only Cress's." The man behind him, the one with the attentive posture, said quietly, "Rowan." It was a single word, and it carried the weight of a sentence. Rowan did not look at him. He looked at the charter copy for another moment, then folded it along its original lines with the careful hands she had seen in the market, and held it out to her. "The formal session reconvenes at the 8th hour tomorrow," he said. "The Guild's standing suspension requires council confirmation before it takes effect. That confirmation has not yet been given. Cress will move for confirmation at the opening of tomorrow's session," she said. "Yes," Rowan said. "He will." She took the charter copy back. "Will you be there?" she said, and she heard in her own voice that she was not asking about his presence in the general sense. She was asking something more specific, something she did not have a clean name for, something that had to do with the fact that she had been carrying her own case alone for 4 years, and she had not asked anyone for anything in that time, and she was very tired. He looked at her for a moment with the same expression she had been failing to decode for 3 days, and now, this close, in the dusk light from the workroom lamp, she placed it. It was not condescension. It was attention. The careful, specific kind. "I will be there," he said. He left. The second man followed, with one brief glance back at the door that carried the quality of a man filing something away carefully for later. Lachlan stood on the landing for a long moment after the sound of their steps had faded on the stair. Sable pressed against her leg and stayed. She went back inside and added the amendment deficiency to her written notes, and told herself that the man in plain wool was a border official, and that border officials had procedural interests in charter compliance, and that his presence tomorrow would be a matter of those interests and nothing else. She believed this mostly. She was in the hall at the 8th hour. Sora stood beside her as a guild witness. Fen had come as well, at Lachlan's request, and without needing to know more than Lachlan had told her, which was that the charter had a gap, and she intended to stand in it. The hall held more people than the day before. Word of a refused tribute selection did not travel slowly in a border town during a gathering week, and the lower floor was crowded against the gallery steps in a way that suggested a significant portion of Veld had decided to observe. Elder Cress opened the session with the brisk efficiency of a man who expects the morning to be simple. He read Lachlan's name from his suspension notice, cited the refusal of the day prior, and moved for council confirmation with the procedural confidence of someone who has never needed to be wrong. From beside the younger council member to Cress's left, Mira Falson watched from the gallery with her hands folded at the railing. The gallery around her held the senior members of her ranked house, their presence in the hall a statement that the selection had backing well above Cress's level. Lachlan felt the architecture of the trap in full for the first time. It was larger than she had understood. The commission she had lost last autumn, the selection notice that had appeared without procedural standing, the speed with which Cress had moved from selection to suspension when she refused. These were not independent events. They were steps in a sequence, and the sequence had been running for longer than she had been paying attention. She was about to step forward with the charter copy when the hall did something it had not done on either of the 2 previous days. It went quiet before anyone had spoken. Not the ordinary quiet of session opening, when the murmur dropped below the threshold of speech. A different quiet, deeper and less voluntary, the kind that moved through a crowd from back to front like a current, and arrived at the front having stripped the room of casual motion. She did not understand it immediately. She turned toward the back of the hall. The man who walked through the parting crowd was wearing the same build as the man in plain wool. He had the same quiet hands and the same particular stillness. He was not wearing plain wool. He wore the formal dress of the Valdric seat, deep gray with the council mark at the collar, and above the collar he wore the rank insignia that Lachlan had read about in the Guild Archive's historical records, as though it were the sort of thing that existed in other times and other places, and would never require her to place it on an actual human face standing in the council hall of her own border town. She had not recognized him in common clothes. The realization arrived in stages, not as a single shock, but as a sequence of small recognitions, each one rearranging the ones before it. The questions he had asked that no common traveler would ask. The way the border assessment schedule had sat in his hands. The way he had read the charter amendment in the dusk light at her door with the precision of a man cross-referencing against memory. The way the sample weaver in the market had not recognized the quality of the question about border pattern ratios, and the way the answer had not satisfied him. The way he had said, standing on her landing at dusk, "I will be there." He had known, for 3 days, exactly what she was walking into. She held still while the room rearranged itself around his arrival. Elder Cress had risen from his chair. The younger council member to his left had gone the particular color of a person who is rapidly reconstructing a sequence of decisions and finding several of them catastrophically wrong. Mira at the gallery railing had not moved, but her hands at the railing had tightened, a white-knuckled grip on old stone. Rowan walked to the front of the hall without haste. He did not address Cress. He addressed the assembled hall, because the public record of this session was what the moment required. "The formal session of the tribute gathering," he said, his voice carrying in the cold room without effort, "is being called to review under sovereign authority." Cress said, "The gathering session does not fall under sovereign review without a formal petition filed at the seat." "The gathering session falls under sovereign review," Rowan said, "when the officiating elder is found to have exercised selection authority under a procedurally invalid charter amendment." He turned to look at Cress directly. "The amendment to the advance notice clause, which your selection was predicated upon, requires a second elder signature. The archive record holds only yours." The silence in the hall was absolute. "The archive record," Cress said carefully, "contains the approved text." "The approved text," Rowan said. "Approved by whom?" Cress held his ground for another moment, and then did not. It was not a dramatic falling. It was the small, specific collapse of a man who has built something complicated on a single load-bearing assumption and has just watched the assumption be tested in public. He did not shout. He did not produce alternative documentation. He sat down in his council chair with a care that suggested his legs had decided the question before his face had. Rowan looked toward the gallery. He did not address Mira by name. He looked at her the way a senior authority regards an arrangement that has been found to depend on someone else's illegitimate process, which is to say, with the particular coolness of a judgment that does not require a verdict to be felt. Mira's hands left the gallery railing. Rowan turned back to the floor. He looked at the council member to Cress's left. "The standing suspension notice," he said, "is not confirmed. The tribute selection is voided. The advance notice amendment will be referred for proper process." He paused, and in the pause, the younger council member nodded with a speed that suggested he had not moved quickly enough on any prior decision, but intended to begin doing so immediately. Then Rowan looked at Lachlan. She was standing with the charter copy in her hand, and Sora beside her, and Fen slightly behind, and she was aware of every person in the hall looking at her as well, and she was aware of what it meant that the Alpha King of the Valdric seat, who had been walking in her market and standing at her door and carrying fallen cloth with his careful hands, was now standing in the council hall of her border town and looking at her. "Lachlan Ashford," he said, and the two words sounded entirely different coming from him than they had coming from Cress. Where Cress had made her name sound like a category, Rowan made it sound like a specific. He did not rush. He let the hall hold the sound of her name in his voice for a moment. "Your commission work," he said, carries double-lock selvage on every high-traffic piece. Your guild archive attendance is documented in the records. You referenced charter text under public pressure accurately and from memory. He looked at her with the expression she had finally named at dusk on the landing, the careful, specific attention of someone who has been paying real attention for 3 days. Your standing is not in question. It never was. She became aware of a sound in the hall that was not speech. She became aware as well that Sable had come through the hall's side door, which had been left ajar for ventilation, and was now sitting at the edge of the lower floor near Lachlan's right side, looking at Rowan with pale eyes and the composed steadiness of an animal who has arrived at the correct place. Lachlan looked at Sable and at the charter copy in her hand, and at the man who had been in plain wool for 3 days and was now the clearest and most specific thing in the room. She had refused the tribute in front of this hall. She had done it knowing the cost. She had stood on the open floor with no documentation and no standing witness and no named authority behind her, and said out loud in a cold hall that the procedure was wrong and that she would not yield to it even if yielding would cost her less. He had been watching. She thought later that she had not fully understood what it meant until that moment. That the thing he had been paying attention to, across 3 days of markets and schedule postings and dusk doorways, was not her commission work or her charter knowledge, or even the double-lock selvage. It was that she had done the work as though it mattered even when nobody with any authority was watching. He had been watching. She felt the heat of that land somewhere behind her sternum, and she did not name it. Not yet, because the hall was full, and Cress was still in his chair, and the younger council member was producing formal paperwork that would seal the voiding of the selection, and there were things that required the current moment's attention. He crossed the short distance between them. Up close, in regalia, he looked exactly like the man in plain wool, the same hands, the same quality of stillness, and also entirely different, because the authority that had been making the air organize itself around him for 3 days was now named and visible and undeniable. He held out his hand, palm open, the gesture that in the formal custom of the Valdric seat constituted a declaration of standing on behalf of another person. She looked at his open hand for a moment. "You should have told me," she said, low enough that only he could hear it. The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest and most specific shift. "I intended to," he said, "when the hall required it rather than when I did." She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed, not tightly, with the specific care of someone who is holding something they have been careful about from the beginning. The hall bore witness. That was what halls were for, and this one had spent 2 days being arranged as an instrument of dismissal, and now it served a different purpose, and the difference was permanent and irrevocable, and held inside the specific pressure of a man's careful hand and a woman's hand that had not flinched. Elder Cress was formally relieved of his selection authority before the session closed, the younger council member reading the procedural notice with the slightly over-precise diction of someone performing correctness, loudly. The archive amendment was flagged for review by a properly constituted elder panel. Mira Falcon and her house members departed the gallery without ceremony, and their departure had the quality of an arrangement dissolving rather than a defeat, which was the more permanent kind. Aldrich, who had spent the morning standing at Rowan's shoulder with the expression of a man watching a very long calculation finally resolve, crossed to Lachlan's other side during the paperwork proceedings and said, in a voice that carried nothing but practical information, "The sovereign custom for border assessments includes incognito travel when the council's appointed officials are themselves under review. He has done this before. The common wool is not theater." Lachlan looked at him. "You are the beta," she said. "Yes," Aldrich said, with a faint quality in his voice that was not quite humor, but adjacent to it. I am also the person who observed on the second morning at the sample display that the king of the Valdric seat had just been corrected about border pattern ratios by a border town seamstress and found the correction accurate. She was quiet for a moment. And his response, she said. He asked the sample weaver 2 more questions, Aldrich said, and then spent 20 minutes examining the double-lock selvage on a bolt of finished cloth. She absorbed this. She looked at Rowan, who was at the dais providing his sovereign mark on the voiding documentation, his back to the hall for a moment, the regalia making the set of his shoulders visible in a way that the plain wool had only suggested. She thought about 3 days of questions that no common traveler would ask, asked in the voice of someone who wanted the answer rather than the performance of asking. She thought about careful hands gathering her cloth from the cobblestones without drama. She thought about the dusk landing and the single word he had said before leaving. She thought about the charter text she had read 7 months ago on a slow afternoon, for no reason she could name at the time. The hall, which had been arranged against her, was now arranged around her. Fen touched her shoulder briefly, the contact of a woman who had watched someone she had trained for 4 years stand on an open floor and refuse to move, and who did not need words to say what the touch carried. Sora, beside her, was copying the procedural details into her own small record book with the focus of someone filing a thing away to be understood later, which seemed correct. The session closed at the 9th hour. The hall began to empty in the particular gradual way of crowds that are unwilling to lose the last of what they have just witnessed. Rowan returned from the dais. He stood before her with the formal documentation complete and the hall still half full of witnesses, and she thought of all the times in the last 3 days that she had read his attention as condescension or pity, and felt the specific texture of being wrong about a thing she had been very certain of. The border assessment is formally closed, he said, and you are returning to the seat, she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. He looked at her. His expression had the quality of a man who has spent a considerable amount of time being very precise about a very specific thing, and has arrived at a moment where precision is still required, but simplicity is also available, and he is making a choice between them. Not immediately, he said. She looked at his hand, which was at his side now, open, not reaching but present. The double-lock selvage matters, she said, because she was not ready for the word that sat behind not immediately, not yet, not in a half-empty hall with Aldrich watching and Fen 3 steps away, and the procedural paperwork still warm in the council member's hands. Yes, he said, with the expression she now knew how to read. It does. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold hall. Sable pressed against her leg and stayed. The hall held its silence the way old stone holds warmth, slowly and thoroughly, and the 2 of them stood inside it until the witnesses were not watching them anymore, but simply present, as witnesses are, as the hall had been when it was built, before anyone had found a use for it that required it to be cold. She lifted her hand and placed it in his open palm. His fingers closed with the same care as before. The world the hall had been arranged to deny her was now the world she stood in. Not loudly, not with ceremony she had not asked for. With the specific, irrevocable quality of something that has been witnessed and recorded and cannot be taken back by a procedurally invalid amendment, or a lean elder in expensive wool, or a ranked house departing a gallery without ceremony. The charter copy was still in her work bag. She no longer needed it for the purpose she had carried it for, which was the only kind of vindication that stayed.